The champagne glass slipped from Helen Porter's fingers, shattering against the marble floor of her Austin mansion as she stared at the financial news ticker scrolling across her 70-inch television screen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Biotech Innovations had just gone public at $42 per share, valuing my little pharmaceutical startup at over $800 million. What she didn't know was that I owned 60% of those shares, and the employee stock option plan I'd quietly established 3 years earlier was about to make me one of the wealthiest women in Texas. I watched my mother-in-law's face drain of color through the security camera feed on my phone, her perfectly manicured hand clutching her chest as she processed what this meant. For 3 years, she'd dismissed my company as a hobby, a cute little venture that kept me busy while her son David pursued what she called real business opportunities. She'd convinced him to drain our joint accounts to fund his restaurant, investments, all while mocking my dedication to developing treatments for rare pediatric diseases. Now, as CNBC analysts discussed my company's breakthrough therapy that had just received FDA approval, Helen was realizing that the daughter-in-law she'd systematically undermined had become worth more than her entire family's generational wealth combined. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was watching this unfold from a hospital room, not as a patient, but as someone who'd finally found an unexpected ally in the most unlikely place. David had abandoned me here yesterday, claiming he had urgent business meetings that couldn't wait, leaving me to care for his Aunt Maggie during what we thought were her final hours. What he didn't know was that Maggie had been lucid enough to overhear his phone conversations, and what she'd heard had shattered any remaining illusions about her nephew's character. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in our Lakeway home, with David rushing through breakfast while scrolling through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence as I reviewed clinical trial data at the kitchen island. We'd grown distant over the past year, our conversations reduced to logistics and pleasantries, but I'd attributed it to the stress of launching my company and his struggles with the restaurant business. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way he'd become secretive about his phone calls, the mysterious evening meetings that ran later and later, the subtle but persistent questions about my company's financials that he framed as supportive interest. The call came at 8:30 from Helen, her voice sharp with the particular blend of authority and manipulation she'd perfected over her 73 years. Maggie had taken a turn for the worse, she announced, and since David was her only nephew, we needed to come immediately to discuss arrangements. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't a request, but a summons, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance that had characterized every interaction I'd had with the Porter family since marrying David 5 years ago. Maggie Winters had always been the black sheep of David's family, a brilliant woman who'd spent her career as a financial analyst on Wall Street before retiring to a modest apartment in Houston. While Helen lived in her mansion furnished with antiques and designer everything, Maggie chose simplicity, intelligence over ostentation, substance over show. The family had always treated her with a mixture of tolerance and condescension, particularly after she'd made it clear she had no patience for their social pretensions or materialistic values. When we arrived at Houston Methodist Hospital, I expected to find Maggie weak and confused, perhaps heavily medicated and drifting in and out of consciousness. Instead, I found a woman whose body was failing, but whose mind remained razor-sharp, her gray eyes alert and observant as she watched David interact with the medical staff. She greeted me with genuine warmth, something I'd rarely experienced from his family, and squeezed my hand with surprising strength when I sat beside her bed. David immediately launched into his performance, the concerned nephew full of regret about not visiting more often, speaking in the loud, slow voice people often use with elderly relatives they assume are losing their faculties. He positioned himself prominently, where nurses and doctors could see his devoted presence, asking questions about treatment options with the kind of dramatic concern that seemed designed more for the audience than for Maggie's benefit. What struck me was how Maggie responded to his theatrics with polite acknowledgement but genuine engagement only when she spoke with me. She asked detailed questions about my research, showing an understanding of pharmaceutical development that surprised David, who'd clearly never bothered to learn about her professional background. When I mentioned the pediatric muscular dystrophy treatment we'd been developing, her eyes lit up with real interest, and she began asking technical questions that demonstrated not just intelligence, but specific knowledge of drug development processes. The first crack in David's facade appeared when his phone rang during what was supposed to be a solemn family vigil. He stepped into the hallway to take the call, but hospital acoustics carried his voice back into the room, and both Maggie and I could hear fragments of his conversation. He was discussing restaurant locations with someone, his tone casual and excited, completely at odds with the grieving demeanor he'd displayed moments before. Maggie's expression shifted subtly, her eyes narrowing with the kind of analytical assessment I imagined she'd once applied to financial statements and investment opportunities. When David returned, apologizing profusely about an urgent business matter that couldn't wait, she simply nodded and suggested he handle whatever needed his attention. Her voice carried a note I couldn't quite identify at the time but would later recognize as the sound of someone filing away important information. The second revelation came that evening when David announced he needed to return to Austin for critical meetings about a new restaurant location. He'd secured a potential lease that required immediate action, he explained, and with Maggie stable under excellent medical care, there was no reason for both of us to remain at the hospital. He'd drive back first thing in the morning, he promised, kissing my forehead with the kind of perfunctory affection that had become standard in our marriage. After he left, Maggie was quiet for a long time, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone processing difficult information. Finally, she turned to me with a directness that cut through the hospital's sterile politeness. She told me she'd been listening not just to David's phone conversation, but to several calls he'd made throughout the day. The urgent restaurant business was real, but it involved meetings with investors he'd been courting for months, presentations he'd scheduled knowing full well that his dying aunt's bedside vigil might conflict. What troubled her more, she continued, was a conversation she'd overheard between David and someone named Kevin Torres, his business partner. They'd been discussing my company, specifically wondering when I'd be forced to liquidate my stake to help fund their restaurant expansion. David had mentioned that IPO rumors were probably just speculation, that biotech companies rarely succeeded, and that my emotional attachment to the research was preventing me from making smart financial decisions. The casual dismissal of my life's work stung, but what followed was worse. Maggie had heard David tell Kevin that once my little science project inevitably failed, I'd be more realistic about supporting what he called real investments with proven returns. They'd discussed various scenarios for convincing me to sell my company's shares, including manufactured financial emergencies that would require immediate liquidity. As Maggie shared what she'd overheard, I felt a familiar sick feeling in my stomach, the same sensation I'd experienced months earlier when I'd discovered David had borrowed against our house without telling me. He'd explained it as a temporary measure to bridge funding between restaurant deals, a necessary step that he'd planned to tell me about once everything was finalized. The loan had been paid back quickly enough that no damage was done, but the secrecy had bothered me more than the financial risk. Now, listening to Maggie describe David's casual assumption that my company would fail and my assets would become available for his use, I began to understand that what I'd interpreted as disorganized financial management was actually systematic planning. He wasn't making impulsive decisions or struggling with cash flow. He was positioning himself to access my resources while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. Maggie reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly firm for someone who was supposedly dying. She told me she'd spent 40 years analyzing financial patterns, identifying when numbers didn't match the stories people told about them. David's behavior around my company, his questions about my stock options, his casual comments about biotech valuations, all followed a pattern she'd seen countless times in corporate environments where people positioned themselves to benefit from others' work. She'd also been paying attention to Helen's treatment of me, the subtle undermining disguised as maternal concern, the way she'd consistently steered family conversations away from my professional achievements while highlighting David's business ventures. Maggie had watched Helen convince David that my research was a phase I'd outgrow, that successful wives supported their husbands' careers rather than pursuing competing interests. The family dynamic was orchestrated, Maggie explained, designed to keep me focused on being supportive rather than protective of my own interests. Helen had perfected the art of making her manipulations seem like wisdom, her control appear as guidance, her interference look like love. She'd used the same techniques to manage her late husband's finances, gradually assuming control of decisions while maintaining the fiction that he remained in charge. What Maggie told me next changed everything. She'd been conducting her own quiet investigation of David's finances, using her Wall Street connections to verify information about his restaurant investments. The businesses were real, but their profitability was questionable, and their funding came from a complex web of loans, investor partnerships, and family money that created significant personal liability for David. More importantly, Maggie had discovered that David had been presenting my potential IPO proceeds as collateral for restaurant expansion loans. He'd told lenders that his wife's biotech company was preparing to go public, and that his marriage gave him access to those assets for business investments. He'd essentially borrowed against my success before it even materialized, creating financial obligations that would require my cooperation to fulfill. The manipulation was sophisticated and long-term, designed to entangle my financial future with his business ventures in ways that would make it difficult for me to refuse his requests for funding. By the time my company succeeded, I'd find myself legally and financially obligated to support investments I'd never agreed to, trapped in a web of commitments made in my name but without my knowledge. Maggie's revelation reframed everything I'd interpreted as marital discord or communication problems. David's growing distance wasn't about stress or changing priorities. It was about repositioning our relationship from partnership to resource extraction. His family's treatment of me wasn't casual dismissal, but systematic preparation for financial exploitation. As I absorbed this information, my phone buzzed with a text from my research director. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The FDA had moved up our approval timeline, and we needed to accelerate our IPO preparations. The treatment that Helen and David had dismissed as impractical science was about to transform children's lives and generate returns that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Sitting in that hospital room with Maggie, watching her eyes shine with the intellectual excitement of someone who'd uncovered an important puzzle, I realized that David's abandonment hadn't left me isolated with a dying woman. It had brought me together with someone who understood exactly what I was facing and possessed the skills to help me navigate it. Maggie squeezed my hand again, and I could see her mind working through possibilities and strategies. She asked me about my company's structure, my ownership percentage, the legal protections I'd built into our corporate governance. When I described the employee stock option plan I'd established, granting shares to researchers and staff members who'd contributed to our breakthrough, her smile was predatory in its satisfaction. She explained that David's financial positioning assumed he'd have access to my assets through community property laws, but stock options granted before marriage and held in trust structures operated under different rules. If my lawyers had structured the company correctly, and if I'd documented my intellectual property contributions properly, David's claims on my assets might be far more limited than he assumed. More intriguingly, if David had been using my potential success as collateral for business loans without my knowledge or consent, he might have committed financial fraud. Lenders who'd been told they could count on IPO proceeds as loan security would have grounds for legal action when those proceeds proved inaccessible. David's attempt to profit from my work might instead destroy his financial standing. Maggie suggested we needed to understand the full scope of David's financial commitments, before my IPO became public knowledge. Once my company's valuation was announced, any loans or agreements tied to those assets would become legally complicated. We had a narrow window to gather information and protect my interests before external pressures made strategic planning impossible. She also pointed out that Helen's reaction to my success would be telling. If my mother-in-law had been planning to benefit from my company's failure, my sudden wealth would represent not just disappointment, but active threat to her family's financial plans. Helen's response might reveal the true extent of their manipulation and provide evidence of their intentions. As we talked through possibilities and strategies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The confusion and self-doubt that had characterized my marriage was lifting, replaced by the analytical focus that had made me successful in pharmaceutical research. I was finally seeing the situation as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be endured. Maggie's professional instincts were proving invaluable. But more than that, I was discovering an ally who understood both the technical aspects of financial manipulation and the emotional toll of family betrayal. She'd spent years watching Helen control and diminish the people around her, and she'd recognized patterns in David's behavior that I'd missed because I was too close to the situation. When visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into its nighttime quiet, Maggie and I continued planning. She helped me understand which information I needed to gather, which legal protections I should verify, and how to document everything without alerting David to my suspicions. She also began sharing stories about Helen's history of manipulation, providing context that explained behaviors I'd found confusing or hurtful. The woman I'd thought was dying was revealing herself as someone whose mind remained formidable despite her physical condition. Her illness was real, but her mental acuity was sharper than anyone in the family had bothered to notice. They'd dismissed her as a burden to be managed rather than recognizing her as someone with decades of relevant experience and a genuine desire to help. As I settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair for the night, my phone displayed dozens of missed calls and messages from David, all sent while he was supposedly in crucial business meetings. The timing wasn't coincidental. Somewhere in Austin, my husband was beginning to realize that his careful planning might be unraveling, and that the wife he'd positioned as a supporting player in his business ventures had just become the star of a much bigger show. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and difficult decisions, but tonight, for the first time in months, I felt prepared for whatever came next. Maggie had given me more than information and strategy. She'd reminded me that I was smart enough to protect myself, strong enough to stand up to manipulation, and successful enough to chart my own course. The IPO announcement was still hours away. But the real transformation had already begun. In a hospital room in Houston, an unlikely alliance was forming between two women who'd been underestimated by the same family, and who were about to demonstrate exactly what that miscalculation would cost. The morning brought harsh fluorescent lighting and the reality that my life had fundamentally shifted overnight. While David believed I was simply keeping vigil with his dying aunt, Maggie and I had spent the early hours laying groundwork for what she called our financial archaeology expedition. Her decades on Wall Street had taught her that money always left traces, and David's elaborate positioning around my assets would have created a paper trail we could follow. Maggie's energy seemed renewed by having a project that engaged her analytical mind. Despite her physical frailty, she attacked the problem of unraveling David's schemes with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among her colleagues. She'd already contacted 3 former associates who now worked in different areas of finance, each positioned to help us understand various aspects of David's business arrangements. The first breakthrough came from Marcus Chen, a private banking specialist who'd worked with Maggie for 15 years before she retired. Within 2 hours of her call, Marcus had run preliminary checks on David's restaurant businesses and discovered something that made Maggie's eyes gleam with satisfaction. David had indeed been using my anticipated IPO proceeds as collateral, but he'd been inflating the potential values in his loan applications. According to the documentation Marcus accessed, David had told lenders that my company was preparing for a potential $2 billion IPO, nearly 3 times our actual projected valuation. He'd presented himself as my business manager, someone with authority to commit my assets to loan guarantees. The discrepancies weren't just ethically problematic, they constituted fraud on multiple levels. More troubling was the timeline Marcus uncovered. David had begun these conversations with lenders 6 months ago, well before our clinical trials had produced the results that made our IPO possible. He'd been betting on my success while simultaneously working to undermine my confidence in the company's prospects. Every conversation where he'd expressed concern about biotech volatility or suggested I consider safer investments had been calculated to keep me from recognizing my company's true value. Maggie's second contact, Elizabeth Morrison, specialized in corporate law and had agreed to review the employee stock option plan I'd established for my research team. Elizabeth's analysis revealed something I hadn't fully appreciated about my own legal protections. The intellectual property assignments and equity structures I'd created were ironclad, with my ownership percentage locked in through multiple protective mechanisms. Even more importantly, Elizabeth discovered that my company's corporate structure included provisions that would nullify any unauthorized use of company assets as loan collateral. If David had committed my shares without proper authorization, those commitments would be legally invalid, leaving his lenders with no recourse against my assets, but significant claims against David personally. The third piece of Maggie's investigation involved forensic accountant Robert Kim, who specialized in tracing hidden financial relationships. Robert's preliminary review of publicly available information about David's restaurant ventures revealed a complex web of cross-guarantees and interdependent loans that created enormous personal liability. David wasn't just borrowing against my future success. He was building a financial house of cards that would collapse spectacularly if any single element failed. As these revelations accumulated throughout the morning, I found myself experiencing an odd mixture of vindication and horror. The patterns Maggie had identified were even more extensive than we'd initially suspected. David hadn't just been planning to benefit from my success. He'd been systematically positioning himself to control my financial future while creating obligations that would force my cooperation. The scope of his manipulation extended beyond financial matters into personal ones. Robert's analysis had uncovered payments from David's business accounts to a private investigation firm, charges that dated back 8 months and continued through the previous week. David had been having me investigated, probably to gather information about my company's prospects and my personal financial management. This revelation hit me harder than the loan fraud. The man I'd shared a bed with for 5 years had been treating me as a target for surveillance, gathering intelligence about my professional activities while pretending to be a supportive husband. Every conversation about my work, every question about my business decisions, every expression of concern about my stress levels had potentially been part of a systematic information gathering operation. Maggie watched my face as I processed this information, her expression mixing sympathy with professional satisfaction at having uncovered the truth. She'd seen similar patterns during her Wall Street career, she explained, usually involving executives who used their positions to exploit their company's resources. The emotional manipulation was always the hardest part for victims to accept, because it meant acknowledging that relationships they'd trusted were actually strategic deceptions. She was right about the emotional difficulty. Understanding that David had been systematically lying to me for months felt worse than discovering his financial scheming. The private investigator charges meant that our entire marriage had become a business arrangement from his perspective, with me as an asset to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. But Maggie's investigative work had also revealed David's critical miscalculation. His financial positioning assumed that I would remain unaware of his activities until after my IPO, when market pressures and legal obligations would limit my options for protecting my assets. He'd planned to present me with accomplished facts, commitments that would be difficult to unravel without damaging both our financial standing and our marriage. His mistake was assuming that his aunt's illness would provide perfect cover for his final preparations. Instead of leaving me isolated and vulnerable, his abandonment had connected me with someone who possessed exactly the skills and connections needed to expose his entire scheme. Maggie's illness had made her appear powerless to the family, but her mind remained formidable and her professional network remained active. The morning also brought communication from my research director about accelerated FDA approval timelines and increased investor interest in our IPO. The treatment that Helen and David had dismissed as impractical science was attracting attention from major pharmaceutical companies interested in licensing deals and acquisition discussions. Our projected IPO valuation was conservative. Actual market response might drive share prices significantly higher. This news transformed the stakes of our investigation. If my company's value exceeded current projections, David's loan commitments would become even more problematic for him personally. Lenders who'd been promised access to specific asset values would find themselves in possession of fraudulent documentation, with legal grounds for pursuing David individually when those assets proved unavailable. Maggie suggested we needed to accelerate our information gathering before market forces made strategic planning impossible. Once trading began, external pressures from investors, lenders, and media attention would complicate any attempts to address David's unauthorized commitments. Quietly, we had perhaps 48 hours to understand the full scope of his activities and position ourselves advantageously. She'd arranged for Patricia Williams, a corporate attorney with experience in financial fraud cases, to meet us that afternoon. Patricia specialized in situations where business partnerships involved misrepresentation of assets or unauthorized use of personal guarantees. She would review all the documentation we'd gathered and advise us on legal options for protecting my interests. Meanwhile, Maggie had been monitoring David's communications through methods she described vaguely as utilizing old professional connections. David had been making increasingly frantic calls to his business partner, Kevin Torres, apparently trying to coordinate responses to unexpected developments in their financing arrangements. Several lenders had begun asking for updated documentation about collateral assets, probably triggered by early rumors about biotech IPO activity. The pressure David was experiencing became clear when he called me around noon, his voice carrying a strain I'd rarely heard before. He'd encountered unexpected complications with his restaurant financing, he explained, and needed to discuss some business matters that affected both of us. He'd be returning to Houston that evening, earlier than planned, because family circumstances required our joint attention. His careful word choice revealed how much he knew about my company's changing status. David wasn't someone who normally paid attention to biotech industry news, but he'd clearly been monitoring developments that might affect his financial positioning. His sudden urgency to return suggested that his lenders were demanding immediate clarification about asset availability. Maggie listened to my side of the conversation with the focused attention of someone analyzing a negotiation. When I hung up, she immediately began strategizing about how to handle David's return. We needed to gather more information before confronting him directly, but we also needed to document his behavior and statements for potential legal proceedings. She suggested that David's urgency might work to our advantage. If he was feeling pressured by external forces, he might reveal more about his activities than he intended. People under stress often made mistakes, provided more information than they planned to share, or committed to positions they couldn't later defend. Patricia Williams arrived earlier than scheduled, bringing an intensity that matched Maggie's analytical energy. After reviewing the documentation we'd assembled, Patricia's assessment was unequivocal. David had committed multiple forms of fraud, created significant personal legal liability, and potentially exposed himself to criminal charges depending on the specific terms of his loan agreements. The unauthorized use of my assets as collateral constituted fraud regardless of marital property laws, Patricia explained. David might have believed that potential community property rights gave him authority to make commitments involving my company, but stock options and intellectual property developed before marriage operated under different legal frameworks. More seriously, David's misrepresentation of asset values and his authority to commit those assets created liability under federal banking regulations. If lenders had relied on his statements about my company's value or his access to IPO proceeds, they could pursue both civil and criminal remedies when those statements proved false. Patricia's review of David's restaurant business structure revealed additional problems. The cross-guarantees and interdependent loans Robert Kim had identified created a domino effect of potential defaults. If any single lender demanded immediate payment or called in loan guarantees, the entire financing structure could collapse, leaving David personally liable for millions in debt. The timing was particularly problematic for David because my IPO announcement would trigger immediate scrutiny of any loan agreements that referenced biotech assets as collateral. Lenders would want updated valuations and confirmation of collateral availability, forcing David to either admit his misrepresentations or double down on claims he couldn't support. Patricia recommended documenting everything before David returned, creating a comprehensive record of his activities and their legal implications. She also suggested establishing legal protections for my company assets to prevent any unauthorized access during whatever confrontation was coming. As we worked through the afternoon, assembling evidence and preparing defensive strategies, I found myself experiencing a profound shift in how I understood my marriage and my professional achievements. For months, I'd been second-guessing my business decisions, wondering if David's concerns about biotech volatility reflected wisdom I was too emotionally invested to recognize. Now I understood that his skepticism had been strategic rather than protective. Every suggestion that I consider selling my shares, every expression of concern about putting too much financial pressure on our marriage, every recommendation that I focus on supporting his restaurant ventures had been designed to serve his interest rather than ours. The realization was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Instead of feeling betrayed or victimized, I was discovering a clarity and confidence that had been missing from my life for months. Understanding David's motivations meant I could finally trust my own judgment about my company's prospects and my professional capabilities. Maggie had been watching my emotional evolution throughout the day, recognizing something in my expression that brought genuine satisfaction to her tired features. She'd spent her career helping people understand complex financial situations, but this felt personal in ways that went beyond professional expertise. She told me about her own experience with Helen's manipulation, how David's mother had spent years undermining Maggie's relationship with the family while positioning herself as the source of all financial wisdom and support. Helen's tactics were subtle but consistent, creating doubt about independent judgment while presenting herself as the only reliable guide through complex decisions. The pattern was identical to what David had been doing with my business decisions. He'd been systematically eroding my confidence in my own expertise while positioning himself as the voice of practical wisdom about financial matters. The emotional manipulation had been as sophisticated as the financial scheming, designed to make me dependent on his guidance even in areas where I possessed superior knowledge and experience. Understanding this pattern helped me recognize how many of my recent doubts and anxieties had been manufactured rather than rational. My instincts about my company's prospects had been correct. My concerns about David's financial management had been justified. My sense that something fundamental was wrong in our marriage had been accurate. As evening approached and David's return became imminent, Maggie and I finalized our preparations. We'd gathered extensive documentation of his activities, established legal protections for my assets, and developed strategies for handling whatever confrontation was coming. More importantly, I'd regained confidence in my own judgment and clarity about my priorities. The woman who'd arrived at the hospital 24 hours earlier, confused and hurt by her husband's abandonment, had been replaced by someone who, understood exactly what she was facing, and possessed the tools to address it effectively. David's attempt to isolate me with his dying aunt had instead connected me with the one person in his family who could help me see through his deceptions. When David walked into Maggie's hospital room that evening, he found two women who were far better prepared for his arrival than he could have anticipated. His financial house of cards was about to collapse, and the wife he'd positioned as a supporting player in his business ventures was about to demonstrate exactly how much he'd underestimated her capabilities. David entered Maggie's hospital room, carrying flowers and wearing the expression of devoted concern he'd perfected for medical settings. His timing was calculated to coincide with evening visiting hours, when his presence would be noted by nursing staff and other visitors. He kissed my forehead with practiced tenderness, asked about Maggie's condition with appropriate gravity, and settled into the chair beside her bed with the air of someone prepared for a long, difficult vigil. What he couldn't have anticipated was the transformation that had occurred during his absence. The uncertain, emotionally fragile wife he'd left behind had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what game was being played. Maggie and I had spent hours preparing for this moment, developing strategies for extracting information while documenting his responses for future legal proceedings. The first test came when David's phone rang within minutes of his arrival. He glanced at the screen, his face tightening with barely concealed anxiety before he stepped into the hallway to take the call. Through the open door, we could hear fragments of his conversation with what was clearly a very agitated lender, demanding immediate clarification about collateral documentation. David's voice carried the strain of someone trying to maintain control, while facing questions he couldn't answer honestly. He was buying time, promising updated documentation, assuring the caller that minor paperwork discrepancies would be resolved within 48 hours. When he returned to the room, his carefully composed expression couldn't quite hide the perspiration on his forehead or the slight tremor in his hands. Maggie had coached me on reading stress signals, drawing from her experience analyzing executives under pressure during financial negotiations. David was displaying classic indicators of someone whose carefully constructed plans were beginning to unravel. His breathing was shallow, his eye contact sporadic, and his usual confidence had been replaced by the hypervigilance of someone expecting additional problems. The second call came 20 minutes later, this time from Kevin Torres. David's conversation with his business partner was more revealing, partly because he assumed the family medical crisis provided cover for discussing sensitive business matters. Kevin was clearly panicking about loan payments and investor expectations, his voice loud enough for us to hear his agitation even from the hallway. David's responses revealed the scope of their financial commitments and the timeline pressures they were facing. Multiple loans required immediate attention, several investors were demanding updated financial projections, and at least two lenders were threatening to call in guarantees unless they received satisfactory documentation about collateral assets. When David returned from this call, Maggie was ready with her first strategic probe. She expressed concern about family financial stability, wondering aloud whether David's restaurant ventures were creating stress that might affect his health. Her voice carried the weak concern of an elderly relative worried about a beloved nephew, but her questions were precisely targeted to elicit specific information. David's response was illuminating in its careful construction. He acknowledged some temporary challenges with restaurant financing, but emphasized that everything was under control. He'd secured substantial backing for expansion plans, he explained, and recent developments in Amanda's biotech company would provide additional financial flexibility for family investments. The casual way he referenced my company's prospects revealed how much he knew about developments I hadn't shared with him. David was clearly monitoring industry news and investor communications related to my IPO, gathering intelligence about market conditions and potential valuations. His knowledge was too specific and too current to have come from casual observation. Maggie pressed gently for details about how my company's success might provide family financial flexibility. David's explanation was a masterclass in manipulation, disguised as spousal support. He described my research achievements with genuine pride, emphasizing how my dedication and expertise had created opportunities that would benefit our entire family. His vision for our financial future involved leveraging my IPO proceeds to establish a diversified investment portfolio anchored by his restaurant businesses. The biotech industry was notoriously volatile, he explained, but real estate and hospitality investments provided stable returns that would protect our wealth over the long term. The sophistication of his manipulation was breathtaking. David was simultaneously claiming credit for supporting my success while positioning himself as the financial wisdom necessary to preserve that success. He was framing his need for my assets as protection for my assets, making his exploitation appear as expertise. Maggie's follow-up questions revealed even more about David's positioning. She wondered whether family investments required legal documentation, expressing elderly confusion about how married couples managed business partnerships. David's reassurances about existing legal frameworks and established financial arrangements confirmed that he'd already committed my assets without my knowledge. The third interruption came from Helen, calling to check on family logistics and express concern about David's emotional state during this difficult time. David's conversation with his mother was revealing in different ways, demonstrating how they coordinated their manipulation strategies and shared information about family financial planning. Helen's questions weren't about Maggie's medical condition, but about how David was managing business obligations during the family crisis. She was clearly monitoring the timeline of my company's IPO announcement and coordinating with David about positioning for maximum advantage when market opportunities materialized. Their conversation also revealed that Helen had been researching my company independently, gathering information about potential valuations and market conditions. She'd been discussing my prospects with her financial advisor, exploring investment strategies that would maximize returns while minimizing risks associated with biotech volatility. The coordination between Helen and David was extensive and long-standing. They'd been planning approaches to my assets for months, developing multiple scenarios for different market outcomes and different levels of cooperation from me. Helen's role was to provide maternal guidance about financial responsibility, while David offered husband expertise about business strategy. After David ended the call with his mother, Maggie escalated her questioning strategy. She began expressing concern about her own financial legacy, wondering aloud about how family assets should be managed after her death. Her questions were designed to probe David's assumptions about inheritance expectations and his understanding of estate planning legalities. David's responses revealed his profound ignorance about Maggie's actual financial situation. He'd clearly assumed that her modest lifestyle reflected limited resources, never bothering to investigate her Wall Street career or her investment portfolio. His casual dismissal of her concerns about estate planning demonstrated how little respect he had for her intelligence or experience. More importantly, David's comments revealed his expectations about Maggie's assets and how they might contribute to family financial planning. He'd been counting on her inheritance as part of his overall financial strategy, another source of capital that would become available for his restaurant investments. The fourth interruption was the most significant. A call from Patricia Williams, my attorney, returning my earlier message about urgent legal consultations. I'd arranged this call as part of our documentation strategy, knowing that David's reaction would reveal important information about his awareness of legal complications. David's response to hearing me discuss legal matters with an attorney was immediate and telling. His casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by sharp attention and barely concealed alarm. He began asking pointed questions about why I needed legal advice, what issues required urgent consultation, and whether family business matters were being discussed with outside professionals. My responses were carefully neutral, mentioning only that my company's IPO required legal review of various corporate governance matters. David's follow-up questions revealed his specific concerns about asset protection, community property implications, and potential restrictions on spousal access to business proceeds. The sophistication of his legal knowledge was suspicious for someone who claimed to focus primarily on restaurant management. David clearly understood complex financial law concepts and had researched specific aspects of marital property rights related to business ownership. His questions weren't those of a curious spouse, but of someone who'd investigated legal frameworks for accessing assets. When I ended the call with Patricia, David immediately launched into what he framed as supportive guidance about managing legal complexity during stressful periods. He emphasized the importance of family unity when dealing with business pressures, warning about how outside advisors might create unnecessary complications or expenses. His advice was subtly designed to discourage independent legal consultation, while positioning himself as the primary source of guidance about financial decisions. David was trying to re-establish control over information flow and decision-making processes, recognizing that legal independence represented a threat to his carefully constructed plans. Maggie had been observing this entire exchange with the analytical focus that had made her successful on Wall Street. When David stepped out to make another phone call, she provided her assessment of his behavior patterns and emotional state. David was displaying classic indicators of someone whose financial schemes were facing unexpected scrutiny, she explained. His questions about legal consultations were too specific and too urgent for someone with legitimate interests. His knowledge of asset protection strategies was too sophisticated for casual research. His reactions to my independence were too controlling for genuine spousal support. Most telling was David's assumption that he could regain control of the situation through familiar manipulation tactics. He was treating this crisis like previous challenges, where emotional pressure and family dynamics had proven sufficient to overcome my independent judgment. But the context had changed fundamentally during his absence. The uncertain woman he'd abandoned at the hospital had been replaced by someone who understood the game being played and possessed the tools to play it more effectively than he'd anticipated. Maggie's coaching had prepared me to recognize David's manipulation techniques and respond strategically rather than emotionally. Instead of feeling guilty about seeking legal advice, I understood that legal protection was essential. Instead of doubting my business judgment, I recognized that my expertise was superior to his in areas where it mattered. The evening continued with increasingly frequent interruptions as David's business crisis escalated. Each phone call revealed more about the scope of his financial commitments and the timeline pressures he was facing. Lenders were demanding immediate documentation, investors were questioning projected returns, and Kevin Torres was clearly panicking about their ability to meet payment obligations. David's attempts to maintain his concerned nephew performance were becoming increasingly strained as external pressures mounted. He was struggling to balance family dynamics with business emergencies, trying to appear focused on Maggie's condition, while clearly distracted by financial disasters developing in real time. The contradiction between his stated priorities and his actual behavior was becoming impossible to maintain. Someone genuinely concerned about a dying relative wouldn't be conducting urgent business negotiations during bedside vigils. Someone, truly supportive of their spouse's success, wouldn't be researching legal strategies for accessing their assets. As the evening progressed, Maggie and I continued our careful documentation of David's statements and reactions. Every phone call provided additional evidence of his activities. Every question revealed more about his assumptions. Every response demonstrated further his fundamental disrespect for both my intelligence and Maggie's experience. The most damaging revelation came during David's final call of the evening, a conference call with multiple lenders that he thought he was conducting privately in the hospital parking garage. Hospital cell phone policies required him to step outside for the call. But Maggie had anticipated this and suggested we follow discreetly to gather additional information. From a position near the hospital entrance, we could hear David's side of a conversation that revealed the true scope of his deception. He was being confronted with evidence that his collateral documentation contained false information, that his claimed authority over my assets was questionable, and that his financial representations had been inconsistent across different loan applications. David's responses were desperate attempts to buy time, while promising to provide corrected documentation and additional guarantees. He was clearly in default on multiple commitments and facing immediate demands for payment or additional collateral that he couldn't provide. When he returned to Maggie's room, David's carefully maintained facade had cracked completely. His hands were shaking, his complexion was pale, and his eyes held the desperate look of someone whose elaborate plans were collapsing beyond his ability to control. Maggie was ready with her final strategic probe of the evening. She expressed concern about David's obvious stress, wondering whether family financial pressures were affecting his health. Her voice carried genuine elderly worry, but her questions were designed to elicit admissions about the scope of his problems. David's response was a carefully crafted mixture of admission and deflection. He acknowledged facing some unexpected challenges with restaurant financing, but emphasized that these were temporary setbacks that would be resolved once certain family financial resources became available. His casual reference to family financial resources was the confirmation we'd been seeking. David was openly discussing his expectation of accessing my assets to resolve his business problems, treating my IPO proceeds as solution to commitments he'd made without my knowledge or consent. The evening ended with David appearing confident that he'd successfully managed the crisis, while positioning himself advantageously for accessing the resources he needed. He had no idea that every statement had been carefully documented, every admission had been strategically elicited, and every assumption had been systematically undermined by information he didn't know we possessed. As David settled in for what he assumed would be a routine family vigil, Maggie and I exchanged glances that carried volumes of unspoken communication. Tomorrow would bring the IPO announcement and the beginning of David's real education about exactly how much he'd underestimated the women he'd chosen to manipulate. The morning of my IPO announcement dawned with crystalline clarity, both meteorologically and strategically. David had spent the night in the hospital chair, periodically checking his phone for messages that seemed to bring him no comfort. His restless sleep had been punctuated by muttered conversations with business partners who were clearly in various stages of panic about their deteriorating financial situation. At exactly 9:30, as the NASDAQ opening bell rang, Biotech Innovations began trading at $68 per share, nearly 60% above our projected opening price. The pediatric muscular dystrophy treatment that Helen and David had dismissed as impractical science was being valued by the market at over $1.2 billion, making my 60% ownership stake worth more than $700 million. I watched David's face as the trading numbers scrolled across the hospital television screen. His expression cycled through disbelief, calculation, and something approaching panic as he began to understand the true magnitude of what was happening. The biotech company he'd been positioning as a risky investment requiring his guidance had just become one of the most successful IPO launches in pharmaceutical history. The first call came from Kevin Torres before the stock had been trading. For an hour. Even from across the room, I could hear Kevin's voice through David's phone, a mixture of excitement and desperation as he realized that the collateral David had been promising was now worth far more than they'd ever imagined, but also far more protected than David had led him to believe. David's responses to Kevin were careful and measured, but his eyes kept darting toward me with an intensity that revealed his growing awareness that his carefully constructed plans might not unfold as smoothly as he'd anticipated. He was beginning to understand that market success of this magnitude would bring scrutiny and attention that could complicate his access to my assets. The second call was from Helen, her voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. She'd been watching the financial news and wanted to discuss immediate family financial planning strategies. Her maternal concern about my ability to handle sudden wealth was touching in its transparency, particularly given her complete ignorance about the legal protections I'd already established. David's conversation with his mother revealed the coordination of their manipulation strategy and their shared assumptions about my naivety regarding financial management. They were already discussing investment advisors, asset protection strategies, and family trust structures that would give them significant influence over my newfound wealth. What they couldn't have anticipated was Maggie's transformation during David's phone calls. The frail, elderly woman who'd appeared to be drifting in and out of consciousness was suddenly alert and focused, her eyes sharp with the analytical intensity that had made her legendary on Wall Street. She was ready to reveal exactly how much she'd been observing and exactly what she intended to do about it. When David ended his call with Helen and turned back toward the hospital bed, Maggie was sitting upright with a clarity and strength that seemed to surprise him. Her voice, when she spoke, carried none of the weak uncertainty he'd grown accustomed to hearing from his elderly aunt. "David," she said, her tone crisp and professional, "I think it's time we discussed your financial situation honestly." The change in Maggie's demeanor was so dramatic that David actually stepped backward, his face registering confusion and something approaching alarm. The dying woman he'd been patronizing for months had been replaced by someone whose presence filled the room with intellectual authority. Maggie's revelation began with her Wall Street credentials, information David had never bothered to gather despite years of family interaction. She described her career analyzing corporate financial structures, her expertise in identifying fraudulent loan applications, and her extensive network of contacts who'd been monitoring David's business activities at her request. David's face drained of color as Maggie methodically detailed everything she'd discovered about his unauthorized use of my assets as loan collateral. She presented evidence of his misrepresentations to lenders, documentation of his surveillance activities, and analysis of his restaurant business structure that revealed the web of cross-guarantees and personal liability he'd created. The precision of Maggie's presentation was devastating. She'd assembled a comprehensive case that demonstrated not just David's deception, but his fundamental incompetence as a financial strategist. His elaborate schemes were built on assumptions that revealed his ignorance about both securities law and corporate governance structures. When Maggie finished her initial presentation, David attempted to regain control through the manipulation tactics that had served him previously. He expressed concern about family unity during stressful times, emphasized his role as my supportive husband, and suggested that Maggie's illness might be affecting her judgment about complex business matters. His response revealed how completely he'd misunderstood the situation he was facing. David was still operating under the assumption that emotional manipulation and family dynamics would prove sufficient to overcome legal realities and financial evidence. He had no comprehension that his carefully constructed plans had been systematically dismantled by someone with superior expertise and resources. Maggie's response to David's deflection attempts was to introduce Patricia Williams, who entered the hospital room carrying a briefcase full of legal documentation and wearing the expression of someone prepared to discuss serious criminal liability. Patricia's presence transformed the atmosphere from family disagreement to formal legal proceeding. Patricia's presentation began with David's unauthorized loan commitments and progressed through increasingly serious legal violations. She detailed federal banking regulations he'd violated, securities laws he'd broken, and criminal statutes that might apply to his systematic deception about asset availability and personal authority. The scope of David's legal exposure was staggering. His misrepresentations to lenders could result in federal fraud charges. His unauthorized use of my assets constituted multiple forms of theft, and his surveillance activities potentially violated privacy laws. Patricia estimated that David faced potential criminal liability exceeding 20 years in federal prison. David's response to Patricia's legal analysis was to demand that I intervene on his behalf, appealing to our marriage vows and shared financial future. His assumption that spousal loyalty would override legal evidence demonstrated his continued misunderstanding of how fundamentally the situation had changed. My response was to present David with documentation that Patricia had prepared during our strategic planning sessions. The papers included legal separation agreements, asset protection orders, and criminal complaint forms that were already completed and required only my signature to become active. The transformation in David's demeanor was immediate and complete. The confident manipulation artist who'd entered the hospital room was replaced by someone who finally understood that his elaborate schemes had not only failed, but had created consequences he was powerless to prevent. Patricia's final presentation involved the coordination between my legal team and federal banking authorities, who'd been investigating suspicious loan applications in the restaurant industry. David's activities had attracted attention from multiple regulatory agencies, and my cooperation with their investigations would likely result in reduced scrutiny of my own business practices. The irony was perfect. David's attempts to profit from my success had instead made me a valuable witness in federal investigations of the very schemes he'd orchestrated. His exploitation had transformed me from potential victim to protected cooperator in law enforcement activities. The morning's revelations continued with Helen's arrival at the hospital, summoned by David's increasingly desperate phone calls for family support. Helen's entrance was dramatically timed, occurring just as Patricia was explaining the criminal liability implications of David's activities to federal authorities. Helen's reaction to discovering Maggie's alertness and the legal proceedings was everything we'd hoped to capture. Her carefully maintained facade of maternal concern collapsed instantly, replaced by naked calculation about damage control and asset protection that revealed her true priorities with devastating clarity. Helen's immediate questions weren't about David's well-being or our marriage stability, but about legal strategies for protecting family assets from federal seizure and criminal liability claims. Her response confirmed everything Maggie had explained about the family's systematic approach to financial manipulation and exploitation. The most satisfying moment came when Helen attempted to assert maternal authority over my financial decisions, suggesting that family loyalty required protecting David from the consequences of what she characterized as minor business disagreements. Her assumption that emotional manipulation would prove effective against federal criminal charges demonstrated breathtaking ignorance about legal realities. Maggie's response to Helen's intervention was to reveal the true scope of her financial investigation and the evidence she'd assembled about the family's systematic exploitation activities. Helen's shocked silence as she processed the implications of being under federal investigation was worth every moment of manipulation I'd endured. The final revelation involved Maggie's own estate planning, which she'd restructured during our strategic preparation. David and Helen had been counting on inheriting Maggie's assets as part of their financial planning, but those assets were now designated for charitable organizations focused on elder abuse prevention and financial fraud education. Maggie's estate restructuring included detailed documentation of the family's treatment of her, evidence that would be presented to relevant authorities regardless of how the current legal proceedings developed. David and Helen had not only lost access to her assets, but had created permanent legal records of their systematic exploitation activities. The morning concluded with federal agents arriving to execute search warrants for David's business records and personal communications. The speed of law enforcement response demonstrated how serious the regulatory agencies considered his activities and how valuable my cooperation was to their broader investigations. David's final appeal was to our marriage, and his belief that spousal privilege would protect him from my testimony in federal proceedings. Patricia's explanation that spousal privilege didn't apply to communications involving criminal activity and that I'd already waived those protections through my cooperation. Agreements left him speechless. Helen's departure was hasty and undignified, her designer handbag clutched protectively as she realized that her own financial activities might face federal scrutiny. Her parting threat about family loyalty and consequences for betraying blood relations carried no weight against the legal protections I'd established. The transformation was complete. David, who'd arrived at the hospital confident about accessing my IPO proceeds to resolve his financial difficulties, was facing federal criminal charges and complete financial ruin. Helen, who'd planned to manage my newfound wealth through maternal manipulation, was confronting potential investigation of her own exploitation activities. Maggie's satisfaction with these developments was evident in her renewed energy and sharp humor as she watched federal Agents collect evidence from David's personal effects. The woman the family had dismissed as a burden had orchestrated their complete downfall, using professional skills they'd never bothered to recognize. The afternoon brought additional revelations as federal investigators shared information about the scope of their restaurant industry fraud investigation. David and Kevin Torres were among dozens of business operators who'd been using false collateral claims and misrepresented assets to secure fraudulent loans. The systematic nature of the fraud meant that David faced not just individual criminal liability, but participation in organized financial crime that carried enhanced federal penalties. His cooperation with authorities might reduce his personal sentences, but the evidence against him was overwhelming regardless of his willingness to assist investigations. My IPO success, rather than providing David with access to resources for resolving his financial difficulties, had instead accelerated the timeline for federal prosecution and guaranteed that asset seizure proceedings would recover maximum value for defrauded lenders. The final irony came with Kevin Torres's arrest later that afternoon, which David witnessed through news coverage on the hospital television. His business partner's cooperation with federal authorities included detailed testimony about David's role in organizing and executing their fraudulent loan schemes. David's realization that his closest associate was providing evidence against him in exchange for reduced federal charges marked the moment when his remaining illusions about controlling the situation finally collapsed completely. As evening approached, David faced the choice between fleeing potential federal arrest or remaining to face criminal charges with whatever legal protections he could arrange. His decision to contact a criminal defense attorney confirmed his understanding that the consequences of his actions had moved far beyond family dynamics or business disagreements. Maggie and I spent the evening reviewing the success of our strategic planning and the completeness of David's downfall. The man who'd systematically manipulated and exploited both of us was facing criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social disgrace that would follow him regardless of legal outcomes. The woman who'd arrived at the hospital confused and hurt by her husband's abandonment was now worth over $700 million, protected by comprehensive legal agreements and positioned to build whatever life she chose without interference from people who'd treated her as a resource to be exploited. Maggie's contribution to this transformation extended beyond strategic advice and professional expertise. She'd reminded me that intelligence and capability were resources that couldn't be stolen or manipulated, that self-respect was more valuable than family approval, and that justice was achievable for people willing to fight for it systematically. The following morning brought news that David had been arrested at his hotel, charged with multiple federal crimes related to bank fraud and securities violations. His bail was set at amounts that exceeded his available resources, ensuring that he'd remain in federal custody during pretrial proceedings. Helen's response to her son's arrest was to hire expensive legal representation and begin distancing herself from his activities through carefully crafted public statements about being deceived by someone she'd trusted completely. My response was to establish the Maggie Winters Foundation for Financial Justice, a charitable organization focused on helping victims of family financial abuse and supporting research into elder exploitation prevention. The foundation's first major grant funded legal assistance for people facing similar situations to what Maggie and I had experienced. 6 months later, as David's criminal trial approached and my company's breakthrough treatments were changing children's lives around the world, I reflected on how completely my life had been transformed by what initially appeared to be abandonment and betrayal. The husband who'd positioned himself as my financial advisor was serving federal prison time for crimes that had cost him everything he'd attempted to steal from me. The mother-in-law who'd planned to manage my wealth was facing her own legal difficulties related to elder financial abuse investigations. The aunt who'd appeared to be dying had recovered sufficiently to serve as keynote speaker at financial fraud prevention conferences, where her story inspired other victims to seek justice and protection from family exploitation. Standing in my new research facility, watching scientists develop treatments that would help children like those who'd inspired my original research, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't David's downfall or Helen's humiliation. but the realization that my own judgment and capabilities had always been sufficient to protect and advance my interests. The IPO that had terrified Helen and destroyed David had given me not just financial security, but the confidence to trust my own decisions and the resources to help others facing similar challenges. Sometimes, the greatest gift comes disguised as the worst betrayal, and sometimes the people who try to diminish you end up proving exactly how strong you really are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these.
Up! Just click and check them out!